Welcome to the First Thought Talks strand of the Galway International Arts Festival Autumn Edition. This is our penultimate talk. I can't believe that we're nearly at the end of 3 days of fascinating talks with wonderful speakers. This unusual version of the festival is taking place against the backdrop of the COVID-19 epidemic, which has turned our lives upside down and hit arts events particularly hard. People have lost their livelihoods. Beautiful venues like this have been left empty for months on end. So we're very proud to be able to present a varied and interesting and safe festival and to embed our wonderful speakers for First Thought within it. A very warm welcome to our online viewers joining us live for each of the talks. Remember, you can watch them all later on the festival channels, YouTube and Facebook, or the festival website, giaf.ie. First Thought talks are presented in partnership with NUI Galway, the festival's education partner. How do we think about the domestic situation in the United States and America's role in the world as the November 2020 presidential election approaches? After the historic presidency of the country's first black leader, his successor has taken the country in a radically different direction, and there is great uncertainty about what comes next in the midst of a devastating pandemic, a burgeoning movement for racial justice, and an increasingly tense presidential campaign that many see as one of the most important in American history. Samantha Power, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Harvard professor, and US ambassador to the United Nations under President Barack Obama from 2013 to 2017, will discuss the current state of America and her recent fascinating memoir, The Education of an Idealist, with Áine Lawlor, absolutely familiar broadcaster and journalist. Everyone knows who Áine is. This is our first event where our speakers are both virtually here, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that that all will go well. Samantha's coming to us virtually from Boston and Áine from Dublin. Enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Katrina, thank you so much. And just to say what a pleasure it is to be here talking to you today, Samantha Power. Katrina's just listed off your CV there, which is so, by any standards, impressive. But in your book, and I want to talk about you first before we talk about America and all the rest. In your book, The Education of an Idealist, you're so brutally honest about yourself professionally and personally. So why did you need to do that? Why did you need to be that honest and put that much out there about yourself and your learnings?
Do you know the expression TMI? Too much information. There is a question when you write a memoir about where those lines exist, and believe me, there's plenty that's not in the memoir. But because I think that particularly for women and younger women, let's say, who might be embarking on careers in whatever venue, there's a feeling that you need to act like you've got your shit together at all times, and acting as if is part of the education of an idealist. Is that I think that's a good idea often, but in order to make part of what I was seeking to do, even professionally, let's say to work in the field of human rights or to push American foreign policy in a different direction, or just to make a difference in one's community, for that to be accessible, I think the personal has to be accessible. We're not just these black boxes and these automated creatures, who identify a set of objectives and then identify the means to pursue those objectives and then full throttle ahead. We have crippling self-doubt at times, many of us, and to the degree that we shroud that, then it makes those who have doubt, who aren't sure they can make a difference, who aren't sure whether they should raise their voice in the room, think all those other people, have that confidence. So I thought if I opened it up, I make myself more accessible, but also, frankly, the effort to make a difference, something that more people can say, oh, I have a role to play too, because I'm not disqualified because I don't have a perfect plan, or I'm not disqualified because I don't have perfect confidence.
But it really surprised me to read all that about you, because I interviewed you back in 2008, and you were just such a woman with a glittering career. You had such confidence. I remember seeing you talk in UCD. You owned that room. You owned your thoughts, you had so much to say, and you were so convinced that you wanted other people to hear this and to respond to this, and to know that this is a woman running around having panic attacks and has issues in her own family. That really surprised me about you. What
Well,
made you want to address that?
Well, let me just say that the most heartening part of the response to putting it out there, and in a way, just sort of making your point for you, is the number of individuals, men and women alike, who I thought, wouldn't have anything necessarily to identify with in that portion of the book, who might be interested in Obama and what he's really like behind the scenes, and some of the gossip, or maybe they like a good romantic story. I try to offer that as well.
Yeah.
But the number of people who say, I lost my father at a young age and I carry such guilt, and by reading about the guilt that you were carrying that you didn't process till much later, I've now gone to therapy and I'm trying to, I mean, it's so gratifying. It's amazing. Right. Or just, I also have, in fact, this happened to me when I was in Dublin doing media for the book. Two of my favorite other Dublin journalists sat me down for a radio interview, and one of them, and she may be watching and she knows who she is, but I don't want to out her, but said, I have lungers, which is my ex-boyfriend's name for this breathing thing that I had when I was very young, in part, I think, because I was suppressing some of my anguish over my dad's drinking and dying very suddenly and so forth. And this really well-known Irish journalist is like, I have lungers, but I never knew what to call it, and so forth. So it's to create a humanity to the enterprise. And again, when I was younger, the books about people who went into public service or who were diplomats or who tried to make a difference wherever, they didn't show all of that. And so I think that one's own sense of whether one belongs is colored by what one thinks people who've come before are like. So I try to make it as much as human and as real as I can.
You mentioned your dad, Jim, and the separation from him, obviously a dreadful thing to happen to any child, and then his loss after that. What do you think when you think about him today, and how much of who you are as an idealist do you think he's had a role in shaping?
Wow. That's such a complicated question. I'd say, when I was, after my dad, we came to America when I was 9. My dad died when I was 14, in what to me was very sudden, but I learned later, had deteriorating a lot with the drink and so forth. But when I would go back, let's say in high school or even in my early 20s, and I'd get these snippets from, his sister or my cousins or friends of his from Hartigan's pub in Dublin, and I'd sort of piecing together as I get older, the features of his life that would not have been noteworthy to me as a kid, right? As a kid, you just, will he play tennis with me in the cul-de-sac? Will he buy me my Fanta? Is he there? Is he present? Does his face shine when he looks at me, or I show him a drawing? Or that's what mattered to me then. But as I got older, other things mattered, and his those who loved him were very responsive to my questions. And so I learned things later, like that when he would go to Hartigan's, he would go with a stack of newspapers, including the British newspapers like the Telegraph, and he would just tear through them and sound off with opinions on current affairs. And I was totally shocked, because I was single way into my late 30s. My favorite thing to do was to go to like the local bar, have the baseball game on in the background, and have the stack of newspapers, which I would go through. Now, I wouldn't sound off with quite the same dogmatism, I think, as my dad, but who knows, what seeps in, that you're not even thinking you're paying attention to. But that interest in the world he always had, interest in sport for sure. And then the complexity of your question is, what a therapist would say is, I got into human rights because I failed to save my dad and, wanted to go save other people. And, I don't know about that. I think there are plenty of reasons to get into human rights that don't require childhood trauma to motivate you to do it. But I I've heard that from enough people who have advanced degrees that I suppose I can't rule it out. But I think I just wish he was around. I mean, that's the main thing. Still, that never goes away. The desire to share something that's happened or discuss something. I all these years later still have. So.
No, grief doesn't go away, but as you get older, and being a mum as well, and we'll move on and talk about politics now in a minute, but your perspective on it, as you say, it's the light shifts and you're looking at it a different way, and it's a different picture, and hopefully I hope for you now, and I get the sense from the book that's kinder for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, writing the book helped. I because it was a painful topic. I never really wanted to engage my mother, who, mercifully is still not only with me, but working as a medical doctor still in her mid-70s in New York, and got to see her for the first time in the COVID months last week. And she's such a force in my kids' lives. But writing the book was like, I became a reporter to my own story. So I kind of could justify to myself bringing up a painful topic, and so I learned things, and I think that there was some healing in that. But mainly, as you say, with my own kids, I think when you are a child, you almost think you have superpowers in the face of forces like alcoholism that are so much bigger than you. And now when I look at my daughter and who's 8 and my son who's 11, I realize I was so young. I mean, I see how young they are. And yet when I was that age, I was ascribing to myself an ability to do things that are unthinkable. So yeah, you get perspective for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about the perspectives you learned from your time with Obama and at the UN. And particularly for somebody who was an idealist, who was so passionately committed to the cause of human rights, and who was there at a time when, despite the best intentions, it seems Obama failed and Putin and Assad ended up winning, really, didn't they?
I think if you judge the Obama presidency through the Syria prism, right, you'll get one verdict. But I would encourage people to be, a little, to see a little more of the full field. I mean, it was a very, believe me, I write about Syria. I'm not making excuses. I think it was very hard to get right. I think we did invest. I mean, there's no foreign policy issue that Obama spent more time on, but also where we had made, as you suggest, made fewer inroads. But I would look at it, again, differently, and to say, wow, look at the extent to which Obama reinvigorated American diplomacy, like opening ties with Iran to secure the nuclear deal. Look at the way he so understood the extent to which our fates were connected to the fates of people living elsewhere, that he bucked even Democrats in his own party to build a military-led coalition to deal with Ebola in West Africa, but did the cool thing with that, which was to leverage the U.S. commitment in order to get other countries to do far more. I don't have to contrast it with the present and the pandemic and the sort of insane decision to lead the WHO, to take note of the fact that was an example, I think, of how American power has to be leveraged in the 21st century for good, and for good that is recognized as mattering for people, quote unquote, over there, in that instance in West Africa, but for good that ultimately, because we are so connected, as COVID shows again, good over there that has bearing on the welfare of Americans. In normalizing ties with Cuba, again, something that there was a big taboo around. And I think what's unfortunate is, just as those investments in diplomacy were being made, just as there was a recognition of how much it would take a long time, but how much the United States could get done, not by bombing its way to certain outcomes, but again, by investing in using its soft power to achieve at least breakthroughs, if not, overall transformations of different places. But at just the time that might have been continued and deepened, of course, we've gone in a completely insane and backwards direction, which we'll get to, I know.
I know, and we're coming on to that. Tell me, you think then, what's at stake in this election?
What's at stake?
Yeah.
I mean, let's start with the sort of baseline. Human life is at stake. 200,000 people have died in a country with more Nobel Prizes in science and medicine than the rest of the world combined, with the home of Silicon Valley, the home of the Centers for Disease Control that has been the gold standard in terms of how you deal with public health calamities. And we have 1,000 people dying every day. And COVID was going to come, right? That's not Trump's fault, but how he's handled it is going to be, in textbooks hundreds of years from now, as exhibit A of how to deny science, how to reject expertise, how to put also, bizarrely, even from the standpoint of his own interests, but some weird sort of short-term, sort of perceived self-interest, political gain, right, of downplaying it for his own sake so it wouldn't mess up the economy in the very, very short term, but also just really dumb from the standpoint of his own political standing, because if you downplay it and mishandle it, it's going to last longer and cause more pernicious economic effects for the people that you're trying to bring to your side. So the stakes are human life. The stakes, I think, are America's place in a leadership role in the world. Note, I didn't say leading the world, because China is certainly filled the vacuum that Trump has left, and it's not going anywhere, no matter who the next president is. But I think human rights around the world, recognizing all of, which we won't have time to get into, but the mistakes that America's made, the hypocrisy, of course, in American foreign policy as it relates to human rights over the years. You can stipulate all of that, and it is still the case that China, now working within the UN, is seeking to right now erode, and I think over time potentially even do away with, human rights norms that are sometimes all that citizens in repressive countries have to turn to. So if you take the people of Belarus, national law doesn't help them right now. What helps them is a set of standards about how you should be treated, due process, right to be free from torture, right to have a free and fair election. These are international standards that were 75 years in the making, that China, because it doesn't practice any of that, would like nothing more than to chip away at. And so to not have America's leverage used at a minimum in a defensive position on behalf of those norms, but to see if there were 4 more years of Trump, in much the same way that China is seeking to erode those norms, Trump attacking journalists, calling on troops to militarizing the response to peaceful protest, encouraging President Xi to build concentration camps for the Uyghurs, having a Muslim ban, stripping nation of immigrants from the U.S. citizenship and naturalizations. We don't have to go on, but imagine 4 more years of what that does to those standards in the world. Like whatever about America and the rights of people of color and the growing inequality and the tax cuts for the rich and all of that. But what does it mean to not have the United States defending human rights norms, even their existence at the UN and beyond?
Many people would call that an appalling vista. Let me ask you this question. The polls in 2016 said Hillary would win. The polls in 2020 are saying Biden will win. Do you believe them?
I have post-traumatic stress and will never be the same, and will never ever be, I don't want to say trust polls, but be complacent about polls or trust only polls. Let me put it that way. I think what's noteworthy about the polls, knowing how many in your audience are watching them maybe as carefully as I am in some cases, but is they're quite stable. They are quite stable. There is not the kind of fluctuation you saw in 2016. You haven't seen a big so-called bounce out of Trump's, not only his Republican convention, but also has spent eviscerating Biden and portraying him as a tool of the radicals and so forth. You're not seeing so far many inroads. What's noteworthy also, I think, about 2020, Áine, is the memory of 2016 is very real for voters.
Yeah.
So recall that 7% of the people who voted for Obama in 2012 stayed home in 2016. Now, for some, that was, and that's millions of voters in an election that was settled by 78,000 votes spread across 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, just because of our weird system. So it was a 78,000 vote margin. Millions stayed home, partly out of protest. They weren't crazy, let's say maybe about Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton, but partly because they saw the same polls and they thought, it's raining. I got to pick up the kids.
Yes.
I'm not going to wait in that line. You know, they've closed the polling stations to try to disenfranchise voters. I'm going to stay home. So that's going to be less of a factor. And the other thing that happened that explains the flip, you know, in particularly non-college educated whites and so forth, is that they voted for third-party candidates. And you are not, like, again, often as a protest vote, kind of saying, I know Hillary's going to win, so I'm not going to have Trump as president, but I get to feel that I'm not validating, let's say, some dimension of Secretary Clinton that I'm not crazy about. You're not going to see anywhere near, you know, those. There may be people on the ballot in different states here or there, but because, as you say, of the memory of 2016, nobody's going to take those polls at face value.
And it also, that leads to a question about the Democratic Party, because the one thing that Joe Biden has done this time is he's built a coalition between, if you like, the Sanders groups, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they're all rowing in behind, and Elizabeth Warren and other people who are seen as more moderate. Is that a coalition that can win at the polls? Because that's the key question for the Democrats, is can they deliver at the polls this November when, you know, you've got all kinds of, you know, court judgments about getting the Green Party on the ballot in Wisconsin and what that'll do to mail-in voting, Kanye West, Trump, you know, giving out about mail-in voting, and, you know, the possibility of hacking just of campaigns, but also of machines. I mean, it's quite a vista.
You and your vistas. Let me come to the Democrats, but say maybe just one more word about Trump and his vulnerability, because again, I think there's plenty to point to that's alarming and that we can worry about. But you'd definitely much prefer to be Biden on September 12th, 2020 than to be Trump in terms of where we are. So just to point to a few of the features of Trump's polling that would worry him, and we're not in the business generally, you or I, of putting ourselves in Trump's shoes, but just for the sake of understanding his psyche and also where he might go and what he might do in these next weeks. So he has really slipped among suburban women. That the question of where suburban women go is still very much on the ballot insofar as there are many undecideds, but he's way down compared to where he was against Secretary Clinton. So that's noteworthy. I think that has a lot to do with healthcare, a lot to do with the handling of the pandemic, but also something to do with the fact that there's a recognition of how vulnerable the Supreme Court is, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg now ill again. And again, how much people are following the ins and outs of that, but that could be another seat. And really freedom of choice, which Ireland has just been through its own process, you know, sort of realizing that for women across your country, freedom of choice is on the ballot, and everybody, I think, recognizes that. So that might explain some of Trump's dip among suburban women. The more striking dip is among the elderly, the over 65s. And that, I think, is linearly about COVID and about, you know, just the most vulnerable age group, just looking and saying, well, 4 more years of this, especially with so far no vaccine in sight. So he would be very worried about the slippage there. He also should be very worried that in the swing states, he's not really very close to 50%. And with no third-party candidates, in most of those states, you're going to have to get quite near, not over the 50% threshold. So it's one thing to look and see, okay, Biden's only up by 4, let's say in Wisconsin. But it's another thing to note that Trump is maybe 7, 8 points away from 50. And it's not as if people are going to learn new things about Trump he's an incumbent, so the incumbent has the advantage of being exposed and having that the pulpit and so forth. But that's not always a good thing, depending how the incumbent is using the pulpit. So those are the things he would worry about. I think you put your finger on things that Democrats should worry about, particularly as it relates to voter suppression, voter disenfranchisement, underfunding the post office such that we don't have people working overtime to get ballots to people on time or to receive ballots and have them processed on time. This is hugely worrying. But the other demographic things to worry about are right now Biden is polling under Trump. Of course, Biden is polling under where Secretary Clinton was with African Americans. And he's still ahead of Trump with Hispanics, but actually quite significantly under where Secretary Clinton was with Hispanics. So you mentioned the coalition, and Biden has done really a magnificent job, aided by Trump, for sure, and the desire to unite against Trump. But Biden really just using that kind of bonhomie and the Irish, sort of glad handling, old school Paul, listening, he's done really a great job uniting the different strands of the Democratic Party, the very far left strand with the more moderate centrist strand, but I think we haven't yet seen, and he's going to want to use the next 55 days to bring those numbers up among Hispanics and African Americans, and of course with the entirety of his base, whoever they are, whatever their demographic, wherever they are. Turnout, of course, is an enormous part of this picture. So you want to, have people. Trump is doing his part by, getting away from his own message, by having to answer the latest Bob Woodward charges on what insult did he heap at the military, and did he deliberately play down the pandemic? Every day that Trump is in a news cycle where he's defending himself about something he did before or didn't say, that's a day he's not driving home what appears to be his main message against Biden, which is a law and order message, which itself isn't proving as impactful as many of us might have feared when he started this now about a month ago. And it may be not impactful because people know that this is Trump's America where the law and order issues have arisen. And so it's hard to say, if you want America to look like Portland, elect Joe Biden, meaning if you want to see protests and violence and so forth, when we're now in Trump's America. So there's an inherent inconsistency in his message, but it may be that actually won't matter. And what's mattering right now is he's not staying on message because he's on his heels through the chaos of his presidency.
And in many ways, this election is a referendum on Donald Trump. The Republican convention, there's no platform. The platform is Donald Trump and his family. And the agenda, is so far from what was traditionally seen as the Republican Party. And just your perspective in a binary system on what has happened to the grand old party and what happens, because, Trump isn't going to go away no matter what happens in November.
Yeah, I think that's probably the darkest dimension of the current moment. Uplifted by civic activism in America, horrified by police violence, but moved by the stances taken, including boycotts by professional athletes, kind of mainstreaming of a set of issues that were seen as marginal for too long. There's a lot to be kind of encouraged about. The latest polling, even if we'll never take it to the bank, is encouraging. The contestation, not by I'll come to the Republican Party in Washington in a second, but not only by Democrats and others of these tactics around suppressing the vote by mail, the attempts to do away with voting processing machines at the post office. There hasn't just been pushback by Democrats or by Democratic elected representatives and by citizens. Actually, Republican governors, have come out when Trump says don't vote by mail, it's all a fraud. They're like, no, vote by mail, please. We've always voted by mail, don't. And so I think, and on the COVID handling, the coronavirus handling, you've seen, for example, in Ohio, a Republican governor, my state, Massachusetts, has done better than most after a rough surge in the spring. We have a Republican governor. So I don't want to cast everybody with the same brush. But even those, this is what passes civic courage, is actually listening to the science on COVID. I mean, it shows you how far from where we need to be we are if we end up having to celebrate Republican governors who are listening to the epidemiologists and public health professionals around them. In terms of, though, the future, and your point that, Trump is not going to go away, there are two dimensions to that. One, will he go away even if he loses? There's that whole set of fears. Maybe we can bracket that, at least for now. Maybe it'll come up in the audience portion. But then there's Trumpism and the kind of xenophobia and nationalism. The fact that such a large share of Americans get their news from Fox News, from these right-wing internet sites, the fact that we now have a fringe extremist movement, QAnon, that has been mainstreamed, where we have actually elected representatives coming to the House of Representatives who are open supporters of QAnon, borderline neo-Nazi, white supremacist mainstreaming. And all of that is going to be with us. Now, I'd say, though, that then this isn't, there's no guarantee that this will happen, but if everybody turned out, if everybody got their ballots in on time, if everybody not only voted by mail, but voted as soon as their ballot arrived, so as to let some of the hijinks, to minimize the odds that underfunding the post office would make a difference. And these are the messages now out of Biden and Democratic leaders, and actually many Republicans who need, again, those mail-in ballots. But if you saw the kind of turnout that we are capable of, if people are motivated enough, and turn out, again, that has in mind the hurdles that stand in the way, so accommodate those hurdles rather than turn out at the last minute, how many of us normally operate. You could, it's not beyond the realm of reason that you could see a repudiation not only of Donald Trump the man, but of Trumpism. And I think there would have to be a very significant margin, and we can debate maybe what that margin would have to be, but for Trump to accept defeat in the first instance, definitely in the swing states, if it's a matter of 10,000 votes, as it was in the last election, or 19,000 votes here or there, Trump will contest. But also, if it's those margins, I don't think you'll see the Republican Party change, even if he loses and leaves office. If, by contrast, you see what's in the polls right now, which is 4 and 5% differentials in those critical swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. If you see non-college educated whites return to the Democratic Party because they see the Republican Party is no good for working people. If you see states like Texas and Georgia, which are now on the map, Joe Biden is spending money on ads in states that have never been in play. In my living memory, 55 days before the election for a Democratic presidential candidate, if you start to see not even Biden win those elections, but really draw a close margin in Georgia, like Stacey Abrams did in the governor's race, then if you're a self-interested Republican politician like Marco Rubio, you have to ask yourself, who sees himself as a flag bearer of the future, you have to ask yourself, do I want to go back to being the old Marco Rubio, who was an internationalist, who believed in NATO, who was a shepherd of immigration reform, not somebody who, sucked up to a president that wants to, virtually end immigration of educated people and offering America as a place of refuge for people in need? That kind of margin would have to cause a rethink, at least among those Republicans who live in states that are more purple, that have the possibility of going blue, as Florida, for example, where Marco Rubio is from, does. So this is a lot to ask of the voters, but it is to say that it's another reason just not to listen to the polls, and for us to be using every day between now and November 3rd, to activate, to convince those swing voters to go in Biden's direction and to turn out communities that do go traditionally Democrat, but are the communities that Trump is trying to convince that their vote won't count, that their vote won't matter, and we have to somehow offset that in our messaging.
To talk about race and Black Lives Matter, but before we do, how critical is it that Biden wins a majority in the Senate? Because, I mean, you saw Obama struggle with Republican control, not, effectively hamstringing his administration at every opportunity. If Biden wins and he doesn't have the Senate, can he deliver?
It'll be very challenging. It'll be much more challenging. There's still an awful lot, especially as it relates to foreign policy, that is in the hands of the commander in chief. So I don't want to minimize the importance of the presidency, right? It's a pretty important job in and of itself. And Obama operated and got a lot done in the world, particularly internationally, even when he wasn't in control of the Senate toward the end of his time in office. But to do anything meaningful legislatively, so for example, California is on fire as we sit here. I have friends who, a friend of mine was noting yesterday that he was struck by the glow on his beautiful young daughter's face. And he was sort of saying, wow, she looks especially beautiful. But, my 7-year-old today. And then he realized it was actually the reflection of the flames in the distance on her face that was causing her face to shine. And that's just anecdotal, just some random friend of mine. 3 million acres have been gobbled up. The prior wildfire record in that area was 200,000 acres, which was, I think, set last year. So climate, Green New Deal, not Green New Deal, whatever we need to get across the starting line, even it must feel like to the rest of the world, but the finish line legislatively is going to require a Senate majority. But Áine, it's not only going to require that, it's going to require ending the best check Democrats have against Republican mischievous, devastating legislation, which is the filibuster, where we now, to do major legislation in our country for a very long time, it's required a 60 vote threshold. So even if Democrats get 51 or 52 Senate seats, we're not going to be close to 60. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure on Biden to end the filibuster, which I would expect him to do, but he will do so with a heavy heart, knowing that just demographically, the Senate is very vulnerable to Republican rule because of the way the states are set up and how many red states we have, as a matter of course. But yes, the Senate's hugely important. I mean, if Biden were to preserve the kinds of leads he has now, and if we were to get the kind of turnout we seek, we have gone from having very slim odds to taking the Senate to, because of COVID and health and the economy being the number 1 and 2 issues on people's minds, to being to having now, I think, a 60% chance of taking the Senate. But so those Biden margins would also presumably translate into that swing of 5 seats, which is what we need.
You've spoken a lot about demographics. We've all seen the absolutely staggering scenes on American streets that have erupted around the Black Lives Matter protests, and the howl of outrage really that's coming from the Black community about their policing and their treatment in American society. Talk to me about it. Is this, I've heard people say this is, a new American Civil War, or it's a civil war that's being played out as the white demographic shrinks. I'd be interested in your take on that process of change and how to manage it politically.
Well, this is where, again, as you noted, Trump remains a very dangerous force in our politics. Trump and Trumpism, Fox News, you have Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, stirring people up. But to have a president who refuses to condemn an act of vigilante violence like that carried out by this 17-year-old who drove from Illinois to Wisconsin and shot 2 people who ended up dying, and the president of the United States doesn't condemn that, him being out of office doesn't make him lose his Twitter account. I hope that Twitter will be more discerning about his tweets and his incitement to violence and the lies that he propagates there that, for example, in the COVID context, are dangers to people's health. I wish they would enforce, again, their policies more routinely on somebody who has, whatever it is, 80 million Twitter followers. But he will still have that capacity to stir people up, and it's very dangerous. My hope is that there will be some reckoning in the Republican Party more broadly, where that voice will be contested. My hope is that he and those like him will be seen in the wake of an unsuccessful election, as more marginal, as kind of losers, fundamentally for having lost the election. Trump, much of Trump's aura and his magic with that, his base, comes from this idea of winning and so forth. So anyway, I think that slice of America has existed. We've had Joe McCarthy, we've had George Wallace, we've had very divisive figures. We've had Southern senators, arguing, to the bitter end to maintain segregation, opposing the Voting Rights Act. That strand in American politics has been with us a long time. I think what's new is young people, white people, young African Americans at the vanguards of the protests, young white people hand in hand in them being not only horrified, but mystified by the use of race. I mentioned a 17-year-old, of course, who is a QAnon supporter. So it's not all young people, but I do think that there is generational change that is happening. Certainly the urban-rural divide is one that is very unfortunate on some of these questions, at least, how that breaks down. What you will see in a Biden presidency, if we're lucky enough to get there, though, is precisely the opposite of what you see from Trump. An attempt to unify these communities, but where Trump seeks to divide, that's obvious. But also in Biden's case, I think not giving up on the Fox News viewer. And I'd be really surprised if he didn't sort of seek to go into the belly of the beast. I think it's going to be very challenging for him because, again, of what those people are being fed, and really it is outright lies. Including about Biden himself, right, which could be just inherently disqualifying. But he is not going to give up on anybody. And he's going to try to govern, I think, for everybody and reach people with his message and try to get to the belly of the beast and do some healing. So we will see, again, what headway can be made. The one unfortunate, the one feature of policing that really one has to sort of stress is that Biden's role, yes, there are things that can be done at a federal level, including through legislation, but a lot of his power will come from his voice. These issues are addressed mainly at the state and local level. And so this is where Republicans more broadly taking their cue from what happens in the election, having an election set of results that causes everyone to say, well, wait, am I, as Lyndon Johnson once said, I think to George Wallace, am I one who wants to burn or to build? And right now, too many people are agnostic on the answer to that question.
Yeah. And I want to talk about then the challenge that would face, say even Biden did win the presidency, say even he did win the Senate and he was able to fulfill the mandate that he wanted to. As you say, Trumpism is unlikely to go away. The damage that has been done after 4 years at home and abroad, and the weight of expectation that he's going to be carrying, to deliver solutions to very complex problems that can't be solved overnight. So as an idealist who learned a lot along the way, what would you say the priorities should be, and how he should go about
it? Internationally, specifically, or?
Yeah. Let's start with internationally and then we'll move on to the domestic.
Okay. Well, actually, you know what? I don't know. I answer my own question because the foundation for what we do globally, so priority number one is get our own house in order, which of course is not going to happen in 4 years. We're not going to combat systemic racial injustice and, have police forces around the land, respect the rights of those who are being detained. And, that's not going to happen in an instant. Yeah. But even the act of having an American president back in a constructive role, using his convening power in the way we were just talking about, that's not nothing. An American president who returns to respecting science, who builds out the diplomatic corps and the expertise therein, which has been ravaged under Trump, but the scientific core that undergirds the Environmental Protection Agency, the Centers for Disease Control. Probably I think Fintan O'Toole wrote this more eloquently than just about anybody, actually, in actually what is now the early months of the COVID pandemic. But the damage that America leading the world in COVID deaths, because of America leading the world in mishandling of COVID, the damage that has done, it just, more than pulling out of the Iran deal or even the Paris Agreement. I mean, just in terms of America's clout and its summoning power, which is what's so important globally. So start with the kind of foundational steps that will have to be taken to deal with COVID, to deal with all the crises in America, the health crisis, the economic crisis, the racial crisis, the inequality crisis. Steps in all of those directions are sort of priority one. And then I think, the world is burning. And, it's very sad to say that, what we're seeing in California and what sub-Saharan Africa has been seeing now for a decade in a way that actually fuels conflict, fuels displacement, which in turn fuels xenophobia and nationalism and all, so many of the ills come back to climate. And so that's frontline. Rejoining Paris, of course, is something we do on the first day, but that's symbolic. What matters is America's domestic regulations, going back on clean power plants where Obama had been, going back on fuel economy, getting carbon clean by 2035. I think it's truly significant that Biden's entire economic recovery plan is rooted in a clean energy strategy, because it's always been seen, even in Democratic circles, as zero sum, where you care about climate, so you want it, you're there to take from the economy and you're prepared to regulate. But this is different. This is a positive sum approach to building back better. But that domestic leadership, again, on climate is the foundation for then going to other countries and saying, okay, China, you've done a hell of a lot better than us in meeting your Paris commitments, from 2015 domestically. But where was it in the Paris Agreement that said you could build coal plants as part of the Belt and Road Initiative? That wasn't in the small print. Like, what the hell have you been doing? This is, not going to be net positive if what you're doing is making other countries carbon dependent in terms of their development. So that's foundational. And then, since I'm on the topic, but also because it's the most important relationship in the world, the relationship with China, just getting that on a stable footing, which does not mean a fully accommodating footing by any means, because competing with China is going to be critical. Again, domestic investments are going to have far more to do with whether we can succeed in that endeavor over time than anything we say. Trump is all about rhetoric and sanctions and so forth, but that's not helping us with infrastructure and innovation domestically. So there'll be competition, there'll be confrontation on human rights questions for sure, and on unfair trade practices. But there also better be collaboration, because I know from my old stomping ground, you can't get one regulation, as it were, or one resolution through the UN Security Council without the US and China accommodating one another, either abstaining or voting for. We can't get the climate cooperation, as we indicated, that we need without there being a major sort of great power compact at the center of what happens globally. So that's going to require collaboration. So that's where I'd start: domestic, climate, and the China relationship. Of course, let me just make one last point. The vehicle for being effective in standing up to China on the issues where that needs to happen, and getting the right deals done in international institutions, given that China wants to go often in another direction, for example, on technology and surveillance or on control of the internet. The key to all that will be strong coalitions of democracies. And so nothing that I've described in the international space can get done without restoring and really reinvigorating our alliances, including with our Irish friends, but really with Europe, in the Pacific, with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, these alliances are in tatters. And so, you can't even think about being effective vis-a-vis China at the UN or anywhere else unless we're singing from the same hymn book as democracies.
And indeed, Fintan O'Toole writing about the way the world, I mean, once America, you know, the shining city on the hill, now the world looks at America with pity. The idea
Yeah,
of
that was the
America
piece I was
isn't
thinking.
living
Yeah,
up to
exactly.
itself in any way, shape, or form, as many people would have seen it at the moment. Listening to you, you sound like a determined idealist. Are you determined to get back in there and do more on all of these issues?
I mean, I think the feeling that so many of us have, I mean, people in Ireland feel this the same way, people in family there, you know, we all feel so small next to these, and I'm in America, former cabinet official, blah, blah, blah. Like, I feel
Yeah.
so small as a citizen. And so I think anytime, I mean, I race, you know, when I get an email in my inbox from the Biden campaign saying, can you do a fundraiser or can you talk to this girl? I'm like, yes, yes, anything. Can I do anything? Sure, anything to make me feel less idle,
Yeah.
you know, in the face of all this. So I think we're all going to be looking to see what we do. But let me just take note on the idealist front, you know, because it's in a way, it can sound like, are you a utopian or something? I mean, I'm very, I think, clear-eyed about all that stands in the way, both of Biden winning and of America's recovery and of, frankly, the picture for human rights around the world in light of China's rise and with all of its economic leverage. But so my idealism comes from, do you like the world as is, or do you like where it seems like it's going right now? Do you like the temperature rises and the sea rise, you know, the rising seas? And if not, then you have something in mind that is a set of ideals against which you're measuring the present, right? And so I think all of us, even if not many people want to embrace the term because somehow it sounds, you know, too airy-fairy or something, but we're all idealists now. At least I hope. Have I frozen?
Sorry, Samantha, I
Did
don't
I
know what happened.
freeze?
You did
Did I
freeze there
freeze?
very briefly, yes. But anyhow, you're unfrozen
Okay.
and looking fantastic. No, actually, when you were when I meant about idealism, just to finish up on this, and I'll hand it over to the audience now in a minute. Sorry, I've kept you for too long, but it reminded me of Obama. There's a way of kind of being an idealist that's about courage and hope and determination and getting up every. That strikes me as sorry. That's what I meant.
I wasn't taking issue with it when I was saying I actually think we're all. I think right now we're all idealists because none of us are. I mean, none of us. But even people on the other side issues, right? That it's are you happy with the world as it is? You know, if so, like, hey, yay for the status quo, right? But if you think that we can do better and that we must do better, I think that's what idealism is. And I suppose the last thing is, do each of us have a role to play, however modest? You know, to believe that, I think also means you're an idealist.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to this particular idealist. It really is. I'm going to hand you over to the audience. I recommend, by the way, that everybody goes and reads the book because it's absolutely fantastic. Samantha Power, the very best of luck to you. From my point of view, thank you so much. And I'll hand you over to the
Thank you,
audience.
Áine. Thank you. Look forward to being in Dublin soon and saying hello in person. I hope, if my American passport will ever allow me again.
I know. Come back. We want you here.
I have to dust off the Irish one. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from Galway?
So, Samantha, we have a couple of questions here from our online audience. So the first question is, if Joe Biden wins, what are the key things he needs to address in his first 100 days in office?
Well, I bet that question came in before the tail end of my discussion with Áine, but maybe I'd just add that there are a set of symbolic things, you know, for example, not even merely symbolic, but that I think would matter globally and matter hugely domestically, particularly to people of color and people of different faiths. You know, so revoke the Muslim ban on day one. I mean, what a horrific, racist signal to send in your first week, as Trump tried to do it. Also, by the way, his version, you know, his Muslim ban had typos in it. You know, it hadn't been vetted by lawyers. It was struck down by courts. Luckily, thanks to some bottom-up, incredible legal work by volunteer lawyers across the country. So we were able to actually 21,000 people into the country even after Trump tried to issue it. But that revoking of that, the rejoining of Paris, the rejoining of the World Health Organization at the height of a pandemic. I mean, these are kind of basic things. The reinsertion of Nation of Immigrants in the Citizenship and Immigration Service mandate. Transition in America starts way earlier now, not only because it should, because we know how much damage Trump will have done to so many dimensions of American life. And so you'd need more time to plan for coming into office, but actually just by law, it starts a lot earlier. And so you will see, again, a lot of measures prepared, including, for example, not just, as we talked about, not just rejoining Paris, but making sure that you have your domestic regulations ready to go so that your companies and your power plants and so forth recognize that it's actually meeting our commitments domestically in terms of our Paris plan that we need to expedite. And so you may see, since on Paris, the intention, and I mentioned climate a lot because of its urgency, but also knowing how important it is in Ireland. But recall that Paris was supposed to be a 5-year a 5-year plan, and we were to come back together. It was supposed to be the floor, not the ceiling. We were to come back 5 years hence. Well, America's lost 4 of those 5 years. And so out the gate, we'll need to do a set of things, but then we'll need to be becoming much more ambitious in a much more accelerated way. I think one of the things Biden has committed to also in the first 100 days that I haven't mentioned is a summit. Actually, I should say in his first year, but it could happen early, is a summit of democracies. Recognizing now how many of our fellow democracies are kind of hedging between the US and China, on their heels a little bit, not sure whether American constancy is something they can rely on, whether America will be there in a pinch. And so that reassurance tour, even if it doesn't take the form of that summit in the first 100 days, and maybe that comes later in the year, but the reassurance tour, both by him and by his senior officials, I think would be hugely important to laying the foundation then, for example, to trade agreements, to climate work, to cyber security partnerships, to, democratic coalitions on protecting our democratic infrastructure during elections, et cetera.
And now, do we have a question from the audience, our live audience in Galway? I'm not hearing anything. Are we getting the mic? Somebody there?
Hi there. Thanks so much for the talk. It was fantastic. Samantha, can I ask a kind of a double question? Firstly, given the combativeness of Trump, which was apparent from way before he was even elected, were you surprised that Joe Biden emerged as the leading Democrat contender? And secondly, given, this is slightly crystal ball gazing, but given how well you know Obama, how do you think he would have figured against Trump?
Goodness. Okay, so first on Biden, Biden was written off after Iowa and New Hampshire, and he was it was very clear that, and it means very clear, by the way, that young people were electrified by the more progressive wing of the platform. I think what normally happens is that a candidate sort of leans left in the primary process in order to win the Democratic base, and then moves to the center in the general, in the national election. I know you're talking about temperament, which I'll come to, and combativeness, but it's really interesting that Biden sort of was himself the sort of moderate, Uncle Joe figure who'd collaborated with the Republicans over the years at a time when, as we saw in those early primary states, people are not, feeling very collaborative right now toward the Republican Party. He stayed himself. And because of the trust that he had won, and just the years of relationship building, South Carolina was his Maginot Line, right? It was, and he said from the beginning, like, if it's going to work for me, this is how it's going to work. And I think there's something, kind of sort of beautiful about that. And, sort of loyalty rewarded his relationships with people of color, particularly because it was the African-American vote that drove that huge victory in South Carolina. And it was just as COVID, remember that primary victory was just as COVID, it was before COVID had shut down our economy, but just days really before it. And then what began to happen as the primary season progressed, because that didn't settle the matter, it was just one primary, and Biden still showed vulnerabilities, again, with young voters, with Hispanic voters and so forth in the primary process. But with COVID, there just was no one in the Democratic field who more conveyed the sort of empathy that people who are losing their jobs or losing loved ones, need. There's no one with the experience of grieving that Biden has had personally, including really recently and really publicly with Beau's death. And so and there was no one in the field who, again, on the axes seemed most salient in light of COVID, where there was no other candidate who so projected just in his being, in his very sort of existence, the antithesis of Donald Trump. So even though they are on paper have some things in common, they're older, they're white males, they're this, that empathy, decency, and actually experience, right, of being in governmental positions, the very thing Trump ridiculed as being the elite in Washington and all that, but that juxtaposition ended up mattering an awful lot. And actually, the number one sort of proxy question for how someone voted in the primary was, in fact, to your question, not about combativeness or not combativeness, but it was can the candidate beat Donald Trump? And in the early states, sort of before these other issues became salient, before these relationships, and his relationships with more diverse electorates, Biden's longstanding relationships, before those became relevant in South Carolina, and after that, Biden, initially people in Iowa and so forth were skeptical. Did he have the energy? Was he still, and as the primary wore on, when you answer that question, the number one answer to that question correlates to who you're going to vote for. So even people who didn't like Biden were thinking he's the guy who's going to beat Trump because he has all this experience, because he's a household name, because other voters are sexist and racist, in other words, projecting onto others, and then kind of you end up internalizing sexist and racist, tenets and saying, in your own thinking, because you're so afraid after Hillary's defeat that sexism again may fell even a really capable, really empathetic, female candidate. And so it was just Trump, because he is so motivating in this election, really got people thinking in terms of the general earlier in the primary, than we're used to seeing. And initially that didn't work for Biden. And then it was like with COVID, the switch was flipped. In terms of Obama, I think it's challenging for anyone. And September 29th is the big date between now and November 3rd that everybody should on their calendars, at least in this country, but I know how much people are tracking there. So that's the first debate. It's very challenging to debate somebody who doesn't tell the truth. It's very challenging to debate somebody who does non sequiturs and, these rants and riffs and who's so divisive. There's usually a question of sort of which Trump will, there's usually a question which candidate, which version of a candidate will show up. There's really no question. Trump was the same person in each of his debates against Hillary Clinton. He was the same person in the Republican primary debates. He will be the same person. And it turns out he's the same person as president, as tweeter in chief, So I think for Obama and for Biden, it's like shadow boxing on one level. And you need strong moderators because you need somebody to be fact checking what is said. And that did not happen nearly enough the last time around. But at the same time, Obama likes to win and is a proven winner. So I think he would have figured it out, but he wasn't crazy about debates anyway. He used to call them public colonoscopies, I think. So I think, it'd be challenging for any candidate, but I think Obama figures out what the what the currency is and figures out how to play in any currency. So I'd say he'd fare well, but he wouldn't like it. I don't think anybody really likes it.
Yeah. In many ways, in his own head, Trump is still running against Obama, isn't he? I mean, that seems to be his obsession.
The obsession,
the
obsession has not abated.
Yeah.
And note the Nobel, by the way, the Nobel Prize nomination allegedly that has come in, and which I note that the statements put out by Trump supporters, some of them spelled Nobel, Noble, N-O-B-L-E. I think even an official statement spelled it that way. But this Nobel obsession that he has, which again, in lieu of running for the presidency and articulating what he would want to do for the American people, this is what he's been talking about all week. But it stems from Obama having won the Nobel Prize. I mean, he just can't get Obama out of his head. And that could prove very useful, actually, to Biden on stage, because it makes Trump even less rational than he is on a good day. It heats him up in ways that divert him from what he needs to do.
We're going to be glued to those television screens on the 29th, no matter we have.
It'll be late at night there. You can watch on tape.
We'll still be watching.
Watch the highlights in the morning.
We'll be watching live.
I know.
Yeah. It's what can I say? It is such a pleasure to talk to you. It's great to see you in such a great form and looking so well and sounding so well and so happy. It really is.
Thank you, Áine.
And the very, very best of
you.
luck on my own behalf. I'll hand you back to the team in Galway now to say whatever else needs to be said there. But Samantha Power, thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Áine. Thanks for spending part of your day this way. And thank you, Katrina. I know we'll hear from you now probably, but thanks for just being such a force of nature.
Thank you to two fantastic women for enthralling us for the last hour and a bit. I've been trying to get Samantha to come to Galway for a long time, and I got my wish today, but I still want her to come in person when all this is over and we can have another discussion. Thanks. I mean, she is eloquent, she is candid, she is fantastically informative. You can see what a marvelous teacher she must be and how much she must like teaching, which of course is one of the many things that she does. Áine Lawlor, what can I say? One of our most eminent journalists, fantastically well prepared, wonderful interview with Samantha. I hope you all enjoyed it. There is one last talk coming up this evening, and that is again on the subject of Mr. Trump's America and the future. Marion McKeown, probably our best journalist on American affairs, talking to Larry Donnelly about whether Trump will win or not, and if he doesn't, what may happen. So join us for that in person or online. Everyone can look at these talks again online, free to access on the GIAF website, giaf.ie. So say thanks again to Samantha Power and Áine Lawlor. Thank you.